We're going to be talking about the history of homebrew for the Bally Astrocade. Who here is familiar with the Bally Astrocade? Show of hands.
That's a lot more people than I would have expected.
I think it's more than like the general population, but that's why you're here. And if you don't know about the Bally Astrocade, then you'll learn a little bit about it in the process.
I will introduce myself first. I'm Kevin Bunch. I run the YouTube channel Atari Archive, sort of going over the history of Atari 2600 games in chronological order, which also involves looking at, what their competitors were doing and the state of the tech industry at that point in time. So that's how the Bally got relevant to me.
And my name is Rachel Simone Weil. I'm the director of Famicom Museum, which is an archive of girls' games, software, and electronic toys. But I also have a background in just video game history and homebrew as well, 8-bit homebrew. And after spending about 10 years making cute, girly, pink NES games, I recently shifted over and started doing some work in the Bally Astrocade. So I've been doing Bally Astrocade Homebrew Z80 assembly for maybe just like a year or so. And so in the course of doing that homebrew work, I've learned a lot about the internals of the system. And of course, I'm absolutely fascinated with the history of it as well. So that's a little bit about me. So let's talk a little bit about what the Bally Astrocade was. So Bally, of course, a name that's known for pinball, decided to go into the home computer / video game console market in the late 70s. So the system was announced in 1977. It was meant to be released then, but started actually shipping in early 78. So this is right around the time of Atari 2600, just to give you some context of when this was. And I think we could say objectively that this was a more powerful system than the Atari 2600. More colors, more RAM, was capable of a lot more things. It shipped with 4 controller ports out of the box. It had a small keypad. Controllers were really interesting for this system. It was a pistol grip controller that you held in one hand like this, with a knob on the top that was also a directional joystick. So there were a lot of really interesting control mechanisms there with, either turning a knob or kind of a shooting with a pistol grip or moving an analog stick. So this system had a Z80 processor, so that's familiar if you know of other 8-bit video game consoles. Z80 is in Sega Genesis and a bunch of other systems from that time, compared to the Atari, which was a 6502-based system. 4K of RAM, which was huge at this time. That was really, really amazing. Had a custom sound and I/O chips. So it actually had better sound than the Atari 2600, which, if you remember the sound, it wasn't really music, it was more just like bleepy. This machine was capable of slightly more melodic sound, not much more, but a little bit more, and we'll listen to some of that here in a moment. And this machine also came, I hope you can see in some of our pictures going forward, the system actually was this beautiful wood grain with gold trim. It has this smoke acrylic case at the top. You actually take off part of the top of the console and it's storage for the cartridges inside. So it's just really cool design, really beautiful machine. I was so happy when I got my first one. It came with 4 built-in programs as well. So you booted it up. It came with Gunfight, Calculator, Scribble, and Checkmate. And you might laugh at Calculator, but actually if we think about 1978, calculators were still quite expensive and they weren't super common. Probably the cheapest calculator you could buy in the late 70s was around $40, and that's in 70s money, so maybe like $100 in today's money. So the calculator was actually not a bad feature, and they were trying to sort of situate this as it doesn't just play games, it's also useful for your business and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit about in a minute why that was maybe a little ambitious. Scribble was also a very cool program, kind of a collaborative drawing program. So if you think of like Kid Pix or something like that, again, but you're using the knobs and analog sticks, so it's quite a fun little game as part of the built-in. So that's a little primer on what the Bally Astrocade was all about. I think really powerful system, had hundreds of colors to choose from. 8 were able to be displayed on screen at once, 4 on the left and 4 on the right, which is an interesting attribute system. The 4K it pretty much was a whole screen's worth of graphics. So we're still in the early days of the console. We don't have like a lot of like screen buffer and stuff like that at this time. But this was a pretty powerful, and I would say objectively like better technically than the Atari. It was also a lot more expensive, and it suffered from some hardware issues that we'll be talking about in a moment. Here's what some of the games for Astrocade look like. This is Gunfight at the top left. This is Galactic Invasion in the top middle. So Galactic Invasion, not to be confused with Galaxian. One thing about Astrocade is they didn't get a lot of the licensed titles, and so they had a lot of rip-off games. So we have Galactic Invasion, and there on the bottom right we have Astro Battle. But we also had some original games. There's Incredible Wizard on the left, and Baseball, Bally Pin. And you can see these games are like quite colorful, and compared to the Atari, like I think they still hold up, and they're quite fun to play. So this gives you a sense of what some of those like first party titles looked like, cartridge games.
So, Bally didn't intend for this to just be a game console. So this hardware was originally developed by Dave Nutting Associates, which was like a hardware developing company that worked with Bally in this. They were both located near Chicago, so kind of worked out. So Bally intended to have this computer add-on that was going to ship a few weeks after the Astrocade came out, but it didn't quite work out that way. But this was actually a pretty powerful piece of kit. It had a full keyboard. It had up to 32 kilobytes of RAM, which is an incredible amount of RAM for 1978. It had access to a special computer language. It's called Grass. This had like a Z80 version of Grass. And if you're not familiar, Grass was what they used to create the animation for the Death Star in the first Star Wars movie, like when they're getting their briefing. That was like a 90-second animation done in Grass. And so that was kind of their interest here. They had a version of it originally. It was called Graphics. And then they tweaked it a bit and turned that into the full Z-Grass, which we'll talk a little bit more about Z-Grass. But this wasn't atypical. There were other game companies that were looking to do these computer expansions, like APF. Actually, theirs came out. It was called the Imagination Machine. It did not sell great. And Mattel had their plans for their keyboard component, which also barely came out and also was not that great. So, in comparison to what those two could do, this is pretty decent. And on the other side next to it, you'll see the Bally Basic interface. So after the keyboard expansion was getting delayed and delayed and delayed because the system itself got delayed and delayed and delayed, they felt like they needed some sort of filler, and as luck would have it, this basic cart was developed by Jamie Fenton, who was one of the hardware engineers for one of the software engineers for the Astrocade. And she did this basically on a whim because she didn't want to write a demo cart that they asked her to do. So she decided to just do a port of BASIC instead to the system. But the only problem was she finished it so quick they made her do the demo cart anyway. But then they ended up releasing this in late 1978, around October. And this was sort of the main avenue for people to interface with the system beyond just playing the games.
And we should say, too, that it may not be apparent if you haven't seen an Astrocade before, but the slot on the front there is a cartridge interface. And this cassette would have been used in a separate peripheral.
Yes.
So it was able to play both cartridges and cassettes. And there on the right of the console, you can see those pistol grip controllers that I was talking about before. Those are 2 of them there, and you can see those little knobs at the end. So what actually happened with the Astrocade and this ad under and all these great plans? Well, kind of as Kevin was alluding to, the console itself was continually delayed, and also suffered from a lot of hardware failures. So one issue was that Bally, of course, they had been making arcade games, and this was kind of their first foray into the home console market. And this was also kind of at a time when the FCC was trying to figure out how to approve these electronics that could potentially have interference. And so there was one issue with this console was just figuring out the RF shielding. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like Bally was initially had no RF shielding on the console, didn't design space for it, and the FCC was like, yeah, you're gonna need shielding. And then they just threw in a piece of bent metal, which actually served as a way of trapping heat in the system. And so there were a lot of issues with the systems overheating. Another thing that happened frequently, this is a little bit of lore, and I wasn't around to experience this firsthand, but apparently when you would put the console on the carpet and flip it on, the static from having the console on the carpet would just immediately fry the systems. So a lot of these got sent back to the manufacturer. There were also issues with IC failures. So there were some QC issues early on in production where a rather large percentage of machines were faulty. Again, the overheating issue likely caused by the RF shielding that was put in at the last minute. So a lot of these systems, for a lot of reasons, didn't survive. A lot of them that are still around today don't work, and so that poses a challenge for historians. A lot of these also, at the time, just got taken back to the store, right, because they broke, and so that was a pretty big hit for the success of the Astrocade. And eventually, Bally decided to kind of get out of the market altogether. They ended up selling the Astrocade to another company, Astrovision, or got sort of rebranded. And by that time, it was just sort of really struggling to stay alive. And this was also a time when Atari was really quite successful, and Astrocade just couldn't really cut it.
Yeah, 1980 was the big year for Atari, and everything else just got left in the dust. So something that was barely on the market in the first place really just did not make it. But in lieu of having first-party games coming out, there was this indie development scene that was starting to form around the Astrocade and the BASIC interface. So I talked a bit about Jamie Fenton. She wrote this BASIC cart, and they sold it. So it uses the keypad there on the system, and that's the later BASIC cart in the photo. But anyway, that's kind of what it looks like, and that's the keyboard, or the keypad as an overlay that you add to it that comes with the BASIC cart. So there's the little row on the bottom, and you push those keys, and they make the rest of the keys do different things. And that's how you program for this machine.
Have you done this before, by the way?
Not extensively.
It's excruciating. Imagine writing a game in BASIC, but then you only have 16 keys to do it. And so there's a key for print and a key for, then you're using the knob to scroll through options. You don't have a keyboard. It's writing a program in BASIC without a keyboard. Completely excruciating.
It's ridiculous, but people did it.
Yes.
And you go and look at these early newsletters, and they were. We'll talk about the newsletters later, but there's a lot of people just figuring out how the system works using the BASIC cart and doing peek and pokes to figure out all the different system registers and what it was capable of. So right off the gate, the BASIC cart is much more limited than the full hardware. So you're only allowed access to 1.8 kilobytes of the RAM because the rest is taken up by the BASIC program itself. The programs run a bit slower, they're a little choppier. You have lower resolution, you have fewer colors to choose from, but you had all these limitations, but people figured out ways to work around them. Yeah, and I think we could probably flip to the next slide there. So here's Artillery Duel, an official version that was actually based on a basic game. And then next to it is Quadron, which is a game from the same year. And you can see there's a distinct difference in, color and, what this objects look like. And just, it's a big difference between the two, but, the basic games do have a certain charm to them. And, it's not just games that people wrote for this, which we'll also get into a few of those a little later. If you want to flip over to the next one. So basically, it wasn't just software that indie developers were working on. So here we've got some of the hardware items that people were working on because the add-under continually got delayed and delayed. Eventually, it got to the point where Astrovision, when they took over the Astrocade, they said they were going to do the add-under too, and then that just kept getting delayed. So finally, another company ended up claiming it and supposedly publishing 7 units. I don't know. But in the interim, people developed these RAM expansions. And so on the left, there's the blue RAM. That was the first one. And this one, originally when it came out, the basic cartridge could not recognize the additional RAM. So what you did is you would call into the system's machine language like routines that were part of the system OS and the built-in programs. So like this was something people figured out early on, and sort of Jamie Fenton surreptitiously would promote by like sending letters to people who did homebrew, and were like, hey, check this out. So like using the calculator program to do your calculations instead of making BASIC do it. So that saves you a bunch of memory and makes things run a little quicker. So eventually, Fenton did publish an extended BASIC cartridge after a fashion. It wasn't official. It was something that she worked on and then worked with these indie developers, Perkins Engineering and Alternative Engineering, which was a guy named Ed Larkin. Perkins was just a father and son duo. And she made this version of BASIC that would recognize all this additional RAM and would be accessible to that RAM directly. So people started making programs using that. And then down in the bottom, I want to point this out. This is a machine language cartridge that allows you to program directly into machine language like it's a BASIC card, basically. That was put out by Bit Fiddlers, which was a guy named Andy Guevara. Have not tracked him down yet, but looking forward to it. Yeah, you can flip through. And what's interesting about all of those is they also used these. They used the cassette interfaces. So on the left, there's the original one with its eye-watering 300 baud speed. It could take whole minutes to load or save a game. On the right is the Astro Basic cart, which came out around 1981. As you can see, it has a built-in cassette jack, and that runs at 2,000 baud. It's much quicker, and people ended up writing routines. If you were using one of these like extended BASIC carts or the machine language, you'd hot swap it out and plug this in, and you'd use that interface to like save and load games, so you wouldn't be waiting around for a half hour.
One other cool thing about this audio jack interface is that, of course, we can still use it today. Unlike a lot of systems where we don't necessarily have access to blank cassettes or they're a little bit harder to find, you can absolutely record the sound of a program on your iPhone. And if you have an iPhone with an aux cable like I do, actually run it through this cart and it still works totally fine. So that's pretty cool.
And I think if you want, we can show a couple of videos now if you'd like.
Sure, yeah, let's do it. All right.
So I think maybe we should start with one of the art programs, maybe the self-portrait one. This is from 1979. This was a really early one. It's like an art program that some folks started out with these and then they started moving on to games. So this is basically just a quick little video of the Astrocade drawing itself. And that's it. That's the whole program. It's very impressive. Diamond's pretty good. This is another early one. We can skip ahead a little bit past the loading screen. And well, a lot of these you just have to type to tell it to run. So this is just a little like video art program of a diamond being drawn. The guy who wrote this actually won an award from some of the other developers because they thought it was super cool. So there's that. So let's see, what else? What else is fun? Do the goldfish demo.
Yep.
So this one was done in machine language just to show like what you could do with it. Just skip ahead, I guess. Takes a second. So this one you enter in what time of day it is, and it'll change like what it does based on that. It took me a second to figure out how to actually program in the time.
Oh, you're using the knob.
You have to use the knob.
Not the keypad, which is what you would think.
It's absurd. I'm like, you know what, 909 is close enough. So like, it's this little cat, and it's watching these fish swim around. And that's it. And like every so often the cat meows at the fish. And it's like, oh look, this is moving very like smoothly. You have a decent number of colors on screen. It's actually like, it doesn't look like much, but it's pretty technically.
No sprite flicker.
No flickering. It's pretty like good for the system.
I'm getting some After Dark vibes. I like it.
Right? This should be a screensaver. Someone should make this a screensaver for my computer.
I'm on it.
So we got music programs. If you want to load up any of those.
Maybe this one?
Yeah, sure. No one get the MP. Was it the MPAA on this? So again, it's ridiculous, but like, it's so much better than what you were getting off of any other game system at the time.
Yep. And I think this has like three simultaneous voices, has noise mixing. It's like a super unique, again, because it was custom audio hardware. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really sound like a Game Boy. It doesn't really sound like an Atari. It doesn't really sound like an NES. As far as I know, there's also no tracker for this system. And just putting that out in the universe for those of you who might want to write a tracker for the Bally Astrocade. I have a little Python program that does some conversion, but it's not really the same. So just throwing that out there as an idea. And
actually, Fenton ended up reusing some of this hardware to make a couple arcade games. Like Gorf uses this same hardware. Robbie Roto does. She didn't write Wizard of War, but it uses this same hardware just with more memory and like a high res mode.
Nuke.
Yeah. So this was a game written by Jamie Fenton, and it's depressingly timely.
Oops.
It's sort of like an anti-war game. So you are the plane with the nuke. Here's a city, and you just choose when to drop the bomb. Oh, just wait. It gets darker. It gets so much darker. Just wait for it. It tells you how many people died. And if you wait, I have another like run through without, yeah. And if you don't drop the bomb, the game yells at you. So, you know, it was the 1980s. It was a lot of jingoism going around, as now. So, yeah. Yeah, Fenton wrote that and a Video Life program, which, you know, Video Life is pretty common, so I didn't bother. So you could show Artillery Duel, this is the basic version of that game you had a screenshot from earlier. And this also has procedurally generated terrain, and it's if anyone's ever played Worms or Scorched Earth, it's that kind of game. So it's like, oh, this takes forever to load. I mean, it's got 1.8K of RAM to work with, so. But so you choose your angle, you choose how much gunpowder you're going to put in, and you just fire and hope it hits. I love the sound on this machine. It's so good. We don't have to watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
It takes a while.
You get the idea.
Yeah.
Anything
Do
else?
some of the other stranger ones.
Oh, Halloween Ghost. I think I know which one this is. I love this, if it's the one I'm thinking of.
Oh yeah, so mod, a lot of people would mod other people's programs and republish them, because that was just part of the scene at the time. I don't know how long this one will take. Oh, there it goes.
Okay. Yes. So the idea with this game was that you were supposed to put this on your TV and put it in your window at Halloween to scare children.
My wife would not let me do this year. Just want to throw that out there. I tried. Yeah, he has several things he says.
That's one of my favorite games for the Astrocade, not gonna lie.
Gravity's a fun one.
All right.
So this is a really cute. It's an educational program. So Fred Rodney here, he wanted to help teach kids like how gravity is on other planets. So the idea is like you're sending a probe to different like planets in the solar system, and then it drops an object, and you find out how long it takes to hit the ground. You can also drop it on the sun, and it's really cute because then it explodes.
Oh, that was Saturn with the ring.
Yep.
That's what that was. Got it.
I actually don't remember which one I started with. Oh, Mars.
Saturn is killing me.
Right? The ring does not appear on this screen, unfortunately. But yeah, like this is to the science they had available to them in 1984. This is accurate information.
Yeah, if you can't see that, there's like one pixel dropping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how long it takes. And you just keep cycling through.
Nice. Yeah, and just to keep in mind, I think we mentioned this, but just in case you forgot, these are all homebrew games, right? So these are like not first party. These are things that were written in BASIC, sort of distributed in unofficial ways. And I think you're going to talk a little bit about the distribution of some of those, right?
A little bit.
Was there anything else you wanted to take a look at?
You know what? Load up the Tin Pants Gang. So this was a cartoon done by a couple of folks. Mike White was the sort of the lead on it. I don't know that we have to watch the whole like 2.5 minute of this, but it's worth a little bit. And the flickering is just part of like calling into machine language routines, I guess. It's not just him shooting everything. There is a story. Although that said, this does go. Oh wait, now I think this is where a UFO shows up.
I love Star Wars.
Yeah, I talked to Mike White about this, and he's very, very proud of this cartoon. He thought this was a lot of fun.
That's some cool sounds.
It's a really cool sound.
I wonder if this was the first console to actually provide a noise channel.
I think you might be right.
I think I might be right. That's pretty cool.
Unless you count everything that comes out of the channel F as noise, which is fair.
Is that a whip?
No, he's fixing him because he's broken. He got broken in the storm.
Oh.
And you get a couple more cycles of this, and then it's over.
Nice.
It's really cute. And you know what? I will also point out that there's a couple games that were written for cartridges. We could load up. Oh, it's a little treasure cove.
Yeah.
This was done by Brett Bilbray for Spectre Systems, which was him and his friends. And they sold cartridges of this and another game, ICBM Attack. And he said this one was based off of him watching Jacques Cousteau documentaries, which is why the ship looks like Jacques Cousteau's ship. And the idea here is you just dive down into the water and pick up objects and avoid all the sea life. Oh, and you have an oxygen meter, and like if you swim faster, it runs out quicker. Yeah.
Or a very large turtle.
But you get the idea there.
Let's see. You have Candyman.
Okay, Candyman's pretty good. This was a cassette game, but it's an extremely fancy cassette game. And they ended up making a cartridge version of this that ran a little more smoothly and had some more bells and whistles and called it Ms. Candyman. But it's the same basic game. This might be one of the most impressive games on the system. I guess you can skip ahead.
We have some loading.
Yeah.
There we go.
The cartridge does not load, thank God.
That is fancy.
Right? Now, you'd think this would play like Pac-Man. You'd think that. But it kind of does. So you want to collect all the dots on the squares.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you can see here as well that idea I was telling you before about this system had an interesting constraint, which was that you had a certain number, you had one palette on the left and one palette on the right, and that was often used for putting the HUD or the score or something on one side of the screen. So you can see the pink and black is on the left and the yellow and black is on the right. You'd actually have 4 colors on each side. But when you look at Astrocade games, you always think about that vertical line that separates one palette from another. Pretty interesting constraint. I think part of the reason for doing a vertical that way is that, of course, had 4 controllers, so I think they were anticipating a lot of 2-player, multiplayer, and having two sides of the screen. I don't know how much that was actually used, but it was often used for doing scores, and so, of course, scores and HUDs often appeared vertically instead of horizontally like we would see on most arcade games.
I think there's one more to show. It's the Cavern.
Cavern Quest?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is a text adventure that someone made for the Bally. You'll skip ahead. It counts down through all of that.
Are you sure you don't want to watch the whole countdown?
It takes a while.
Wow. No joke. It does take a while. Okay.
So in this one, you're supposed to go into this cave to find some old buried treasure and then escape. And you pick a direction in each one, and occasionally you come across an object. I did not finish this game because it's really the cave sort of loops back in on itself and all sorts of weird stuff. But yeah. So I think that's
very
pretty
cool.
good. So probably, I haven't done a count myself, but I've heard an estimate of, a few hundred of these games were made. And some of them were published on cassettes and sold in stores or through mail order, and others were printed up in these newsletters as code listings. And these newsletters were sort of like the hub for indie developers. at large. So the one on the left is sort of the biggest one. It's the Arcadian, and that started in '78, not too long after the system came out. And that ran until 1986, I believe, was when the last issue got published, by which point there was only like a few dozen people left. But this was sort of like where they'd publish news, they'd publish tutorials on how to work with the basic carts or the machine language routines. This is where they'd publish new tricks people had found how to use these machines. It's also where you can find a lot of news about the Astrocade. If you're doing historical research, this is such a huge like bonus. And all of these have been scanned in because the guy who published most of them, Bob Fabris, he donated them to another fellow who runs Bally Alley, Adam Triunfo. I think that's how it's pronounced. And he just published them all up there. And on the right was sort of the second biggest one, Cursor, and that ran for a couple of years too. That's sort of the same basic idea. And this was sort of this was sort of like a meeting ground. And beyond that, there were also user groups that would come up. Yeah. So there were all sorts of different user groups in different parts of the country. Some of these put out newsletters, and some of those still survive. So like BallyAlley.com has the newsletters for Michigan's group, the Michigan BUG, which is one of the bigger ones as far as I can tell. There was the Niagara BUG, which was sort of like southern Ontario, right across the Niagara River. There was one in Maryland, of which they have one issue still surviving. And then, if you read the Arcadian and some of the other newsletters, you'll see advertisements for other groups like New Jersey, the upper Midwest, like Minnesota, North Dakota, and, just different regions. Not every region had one of these. And I should note that if you didn't live in these areas, that didn't mean you didn't get these newsletters. I talked to one fellow who was based out of Kansas City who had a subscription to the Niagara one. So it was a good way to just get your information out there. And so folks who were part of these user groups, they'd have meetups, they'd get together, they'd have, I guess, sort of like proto game jams. They'd have programming competitions and contests. They'd trade high scores and they'd trade games and they'd modify each other's programs. And occasionally they'd get visited by someone from Bally or Astrovision who'd come and talk about the system. I know Jamie Fenton came out to a couple of these. And on the left there is some photos from the Astro Bash, which was sort of the biggest meetup. It was supposed to be a one-day thing, but it ended up going for 3 because no one wanted to leave. And that was in South Lyon, Michigan. So anyone who's from Michigan should know where that is. It's right near Detroit. It had concerts because a few of the people who were working on these things were also musicians, so they brought their gear.
It sounds kind of like MAGFest.
Yeah, it's the original MAGFest. And so this happened one time. They had successive meetups a couple times called the Astro Meets, they called them, but never got anything as big as this. They said they had people from 7 states in their write-ups about it who came out to this, the furthest from Maryland, and that was an Astrovision representative. But these are super cool, and so between these meetups and the newsletters, people were still putting out their information about what they were working on. I should note that in the last couple issues of the Arcadian, there was a fellow, Mike White, the guy who did the Tin Pants Gang. He offered up to sell basic programs that would run off of a cartridge. So you'd ask him which basic program you wanted to run, and he would just load it up on a cart, and it would auto boot and everything. He also sold unreleased games that had come into his possession in through other people who got them in circumstances he was not privy to and did not ask about.
Yeah, there's some great, some of these, the newsletters would have these order forms, right? Circle all the games you want and, put some cash in an envelope, basically, and I'll send you the games. And some of the descriptions for games were just a bunch of question marks, or I think this is someone's unfinished game. I don't know how to play it. $40,
Yeah.
Like there was a game where it's sort of like a little computer people type game where it's like a house that sort of runs on its own, and it was like never finished. There was a fawn dungeon, which is like, I don't know, there's a cowboy and a fawn, and I think like no one finished the game, but I'm selling it anyway. So this is like these very like earnest, like written on a typewriter, just like cut out the form and send it in the mail. So those are really, really fascinating to see people like selling other people's unfinished games that like nobody even knows if they work or how to play them.
And some people like would pick up unfinished programs and finish them, and they'd sell that or put up as a code listing or something. So it was really cool. So some of the unreleased games I'll just go over real quick. Like there was a Music Maker game that never got published. Astrovision publicized it, and it was going to be a game where you just learn how to program music for the system. And there was a Conan the Barbarian game, bowling, checkers, stuff like that. And he said to me that he got the parts to make 258 games. Of those, 110 of them were basic cards, and 2 of them that were really popular were Yahtzee for some reason, and Old Bent Nose, which was a mashup of Concentration, Tic-Tac-Toe, and Old Maid. And if you have any idea how that all comes together, you're better than I. I think I'm good.
So I think, for me, what I find really interesting about the Astrocade, I kind of wanted to share sort of some ideas for the future of Astrocade Homebrew, is this idea of like fuzzy memories. The Astrocade is something that it's not part of our like collective consciousness as, people who are interested in retro games. This isn't like one of the classics. It's not canonical. A lot of it is vaporware. A lot of things for the system never came out, or they supposedly came out, but no one's ever seen one. And I think that's actually like the perfect environment for creating new homebrew, right? Is like when the history is sort of vague, because you can go in and make these little like alternate universes and alternate histories. I think like the history of the Datamax UV1, for example, this is what the ad under sort of turned into. There's a photograph of it on the left. In the middle is a still from a demonstration video of how to paint on screen with grass. And on the right is a screenshot from Jane Veter's interactive electronic art project called VizGame, which runs on the Datamax UV1. And so these machines existed, but like what happened to them? Are there any that work? Have we ever seen one? Like clearly they did exist, and we think that maybe there were a couple hundred of them, but there's not a lot known about them. And I think that like provides a really interesting opportunity for homebrewers and historians to kind of fill in the gaps in creative ways and maybe use the opportunity to create new homebrew. And that's what really excited me about the Astrocade, was this like, nobody really remembers it that well, so let's like do something really interesting with it. Again, like this idea of like vaporware and stuff that maybe did or didn't come out. The screenshot on the left is it is like a basic game that someone made. It's just a fortune teller, and it just generates sort of it puts random sentence fragments together to create horoscopes or fortunes. I just love it. It's so random and bizarre and wonderful. On the right is a cassette for the color organ, which was meant to be something like the Atari music video, basically something that had a hardware component that would you would be able to input sound into, and then the game console would actually create graphics, generative graphics based on that audio. And so color organs were popular in the 70s. Radio Shack had one. You would put in audio signal, and it would sort of flashlights and things like that. And this was meant to be the Astrocade version of that. As far as I know, this hardware was never created. There's a cassette of the demo, but again, like, don't know if it works without the hardware. I think it would be really fun to create one of these today. I think it'd be quite straightforward to do with an Arduino or something. So Astrocade Homebrew is still happening. There is still an indie scene. There aren't very many people in it, but I know the two of us are working to kind of keep it alive and keep things going. So a couple of things that I've done with the Astrocade is actually create a dev cart. And this isn't the first dev cart. Folks have been making these, but this one is a fairly recent one. I have a one here if anyone wants to come take a look at it after the talk. So this is just a way to play cartridge games, or play games on original hardware of your own creation. In the middle, I have AstroPaint, which is basically art software to create graphics for the Astrocade. So unlike NES and some of the other 8-bit consoles, Game Boy, there aren't really any tools for developing for the Astrocade. And when I got to the scene, I was like, cool, let me go download the, oh no, there's nothing, okay. So I started creating my own image conversion scripts in Python, started building out my own libraries and things like that, and then created this program which works in the browser and lets you draw screens. So this was a piece of artwork that I did for Astrocade. This does actually run on an Astrocade. Again, you can see, I mentioned that thing about the color boundary. So if you kind of mentally cover up the right side of the image, you can see 4 colors on the left and 4 colors on the right. So this takes advantage of all of the colors that are able to be seen on the Astrocade at once. So this is actually more graphically advanced than I think a lot of cartridge games. Not that I'm not saying I'm like a great artist. What I'm saying is that this pretty much took up like all of the RAM to display this. So it's not very practical for a full game because it does take up so much of the available RAM. Like you wouldn't even have space for variables and stuff that you kind of need.
Get one of those RAM expansion.
Get one of those RAM expansion cards, and then we'll finish that game. And then on the left side here is the 8-bit workshop.com. So if you haven't checked out 8-bit workshop, it's really cool in-browser IDE with a code editor on the left and an browser emulator on the right. And this is really helpful because you can go in and there's actually source code that's pre-populated, so you can go in and change things and actually see them in real time, compile, and run in the emulator. And this started out for the Atari 2600, but it's been, over the years, expanded to apply to other consoles. And actually, just on Christmas, Astrocade support was added, and several of my open source ROMs for Astrocade are actually part of the default set. So when you go to 8bitworkshop.com, pull up the Astrocade, all of my very highly commented assembly code is there. You can try changing out strings and trying new routines and things like that. So that's a really, really great way to get started with Astrocade Homebrew because setting up the emulator is quite challenging. So for Astrocade, typically you would be emulating in MAME. One difficult thing is with Homebrew, it's searching for a hash before it loads the ROM. And so, of course, with Homebrew, you don't necessarily know what the hash is going to be because you've just compiled it. So you have to do this weird thing where you make a script that grabs the hash and then feeds it to the emulator before it's a very complicated and brittle workflow. So something like this where it runs in the browser is pretty cool. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there are other homebrew tools that you wanted to mention. Or recently, you were saying that the MAME emulation did get support for cartridges, which it didn't have for years. Is that right?
So it had support for the carts, but...
cassettes.
Yeah. Earlier this year, they added in support, or I guess technically last year, they added in support for all of these cassette programs that run in BASIC. Just got overlooked, I guess. So it was pretty quick and dirty addition. And they also added in support for the expanded RAM. So if you want to play with any of that stuff, now's your chance.
Yep. So I think that kind of concludes what we wanted to talk about. I did want to leave you guys with some resources. If you're interested in learning more about the Astrocade, Bally Alley, we've mentioned, it is the ultimate resource for everything Bally Astrocade related. And I'm very firm in believing that we wouldn't be here talking about it. No one would know about it without this website. It is the singular force that has helped the Astrocade survive in history. And I think it's a great illustration of how much difference one person's effort can make because it's a true masterpiece of a website and pretty much done by one human being.
Yeah, he saved all of these cassette games you saw. He reached out to the people who still had copies of them and asked if he could rip them, and he scanned all those newsletters with him and a friend of his. And
yep.
It's ridiculous.
I actually went to visit him a year or two ago and got to rummage through his archives, and what a great person, and also what an amazing collection of stuff. Another thing to check out is we mentioned Dave Nutting Associates. They published something called the Nutting Manual, which is what a lot of folks learning Astrocade development will refer to. There's also the Better Bally book, which is it's Nathan Altus, right, who did that, the kind of a rewriting, a contemporary web-based rewriting of that manual. 8-Bit Workshop IDE, which I mentioned before, if you want to actually try your hand at homebrew, whether that's looking at some of the existing source code or writing your own. And lastly, the Atari Age forums. Although Astrocade is not associated with Atari in any way, the Atari Age forums has a other consoles section, subforum, and that's where a lot of active Astrocade discussion takes place.
Yeah. There was a Yahoo group that just got moved over to Groups.io, so you can look that up. Most stuff just gets cross-posted back and forth to the Atari Age forum, but it tends to be a livelier discussion source, I think, and that's where a lot of the old-timers who are still involved with the Astrocades are active on. And yeah, I guess we could mention that one of those guys, Ken Lill, he up until recently, and I think someone else took it over, he designed a modern RAM expansion for the thing up to 64K, and that plugs into the, what would you call the expansion port on the back of the system. Just pop off the back panel, plug that in, and you're good to go. And he sells a multi-cart that has some of the homebrew games on it and all of the officially released stuff.
Cool. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left in our time, so we're happy to take questions if anyone's got them. Yeah.
So I'm curious about, someone who's interested in potentially doing some stuff with this. I'm interested in how emulation interacts with some of these expansions. Is it possible to emulate the 64K RAM expansion or the 32K RAM expansion from earlier or some other thing in an emulated system, or would I have to own the original hardware and an expansion, a physical expansion, in order to mess around with that?
So the question was whether or not it was possible to work with any of those expansions for the hardware and emulation, and to my knowledge, yes. When MAME implemented the basic games, they also implemented in the RAM expansion options, so you should be able to access those through the same thing. It's just, as she was saying, kind of a hot mess to work with.
Yep.
Is there an estimate of the number of working units still left in existence?
Of the Astrocade, I have no idea. I'm not even sure how many they sold. I have not been able to get firm numbers on that.
Yeah, I've got one. How many do you have? Yeah.
I think there's probably several thousand that still run just fine, at least.
It's pretty common for folks to take out the RF shielding because of the overheating issues. Although the standard advice is that if your Astrocade is working, don't touch it.
If you do crack it open, it's probably useful to put heat sinks on the custom chips and run it on a laptop cooler, because that's what I do, and it seems to help a lot.
Yeah, so you showed us one game that had pretty good music, and you did mention that the music is kind of primitive, but it's better than, say, the Atari, which is, very rudimentary. I noticed that in that one game, the pirate game, the music cut out when the sound effects came in.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the capabilities? Is it multi-channel? What can it do?
Yeah, so as I recall, it's 3-channel or 3 simultaneous voices, and those voices pretty much all have the same sound. They're just sort of dupes, as I recall. You can mix in noise, and there's I'm trying to think of if there are any other effects. I think volume, so you can do a volume envelope and noise mixing. In terms of the sound cutting out or the music cutting out for audio effects, I guess if you had 3-channel music and then you wanted to use one of those channels for a sound effect, you would disable that one channel, play your sound effect, and then re-enable it. So that may be what you were hearing. I'm not exactly sure the specifics on that. Also, anything that was made in BASIC probably didn't have the same access to like all the music registers that you would have in writing assembly. So when I say like you have 3 channels and you have this noise that you can mix in, that's for writing in assembly. I'm not sure whether, I don't know if you know, what the, like, I assume that when you're writing something in BASIC, it's more limited.
I think basic audio capabilities are about the same. It's just you have so much less memory to work with, and things have to, everything's much more limited in how it can move and operate. So like, if you get a lot of music in BASIC, it's generally when nothing else is happening on screen. Yes.
This is going to be a leading question. When you talk about a compiler, like how sophisticated is that? Are you still writing like it's an assembly language and you have every transaction, or is it a little bit higher level and it has control structure?
Yeah, so you're writing it in Z80. I'm using the ZMAC assembler, and I believe it was actually written in like 1979. Like the binary is actually still from like maybe not 1979, but it's old, and it somehow still runs on a contemporary computer. So yeah, it's one interesting thing about writing assembly language for Astrocade, though, is that there was this kind of middleman OS. So you weren't writing instructions directly to the CPU. You were writing them to this sort of intermediate that would then pass those instructions on to the CPU. And the reasoning behind that had to do with that add under and this idea that maybe the system could be upgraded at some point, maybe it would have coprocessors or new processors. They didn't want to lock the assembly language into whatever, the Z80. And so it had this sort of middleman thing. And so what ended up happening is you're writing assembly language, and it's a syntax of Z80, but it kind of feels like BASIC. So you might draw a rectangle on the screen and do like, LDA 0, you're gonna load 0, and that's gonna be the starting point for your rectangle, and then maybe you'll store that in a register, and then you'll load 85, and that's the next coordinate. And that's not really how like assembly language usually works. It feels more like BASIC, like a rect blah, blah, blah. And it was this sort of, it's this interesting melding of assembly language and sort of what feels like BASIC, because it had all these built-in routines to do things like line drawing, fills, stuff like that, written in the syntax of assembly, but kind of with a feeling of BASIC. It's really bizarre, actually, but interesting.
Yes.
You said you were able to save the audio of your programs to your phone. Do you have to play around with any settings for how the audio gets saved to your phone so it doesn't get compressed and lose data?
You just put it on there as a WAV file, and if you play it back loud enough, it reads it just fine.
Yeah, it's mostly volume, actually, and also I think your cable has to be mono.
Yeah.
Right, so like a stereo aux won't work, right?
I think you can use a stereo. I've used a stereo aux.
Or maybe the mix has to be mono.
The mix has to be mono, and
Yeah.
fortunately, I think all the mixes on Bally Alley are mono, so that's pretty easy. But it's not too difficult to get them running that way.
Because I've dealt with Family Basic with Famicom, and I've been able to figure out how to save programs to my computer, but I couldn't get it to work on the movies.
Yeah, that might be why. Also, if anyone has a UV1, for the love of God,
Please let us know.
we need that thing backed up so we can, maybe finally get the add under working in emulation.
I think that just about does it for our time. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you.